Property investors as a group are often painted in an unsympathetic light by the media and blamed for housing unaffordability. Yet the important role that we play in the economy is often understated. We're largely left out of consultation when it comes to policy formation, but used as pawns by politicians, particularly when they need a tax grab. What threats are on the horizon for property investors and what can be done about them? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au. We're joined today by the Chair of PICA, the Property Investors Council of Australia, Ben Kingsley. Ben is also the founder of advisory business in Power Wealth and may well be best known for co-hosting the Property Couch podcast with my old small screen co-host, Bryce Holdaway. He's passionate about educating investors and also bringing them together so that they can have a more powerful voice. I should say bringing us together. Thanks for joining us today, Ben. We really think this is an important topic.
Thanks for having me.
Ben, I mean, it's a very interesting topic. Investors are always the first person who gets shot whenever the property market's rising. At the moment, they're sort of got a get out of jail free card because they're not the reason property prices are rising so much, but they're sort of growing to be a big part of it, and they're going to basically be targeted again as soon as they start to become a big part of the market. So why do you think PICA is so important, and why did you set it up in the first place?
Yeah, so a quick backstory there is that I was the chair of the Property Professionals of Australia, so the PIPA Association, and work with that board. Now that board is really about sort of bringing all the best of the industry together under an industry association umbrella. But during that time, it was really clear to me that consumers didn't also have a voice in this place. So it's really nice that you have a professional association who have a code of conduct, but there was nothing for the actual investor. So the brainwave was to, with PIPA's support, I should say, we set up the Property Investors Council of Australia. Now, again, the idea was sort of around this voice for the property investors. So run by property investors for the benefit of property investors. So we set up a charter, and it's really important for people to understand. It's a not-for-profit. We all sort of volunteer our time, and we have, over 3,500 members in the association. And all we're doing is basically trying to make sure, as Veronica said there, was to ensure we have a voice. So our charter reads, advocate on behalf of property investors. Number 2, play an active role in educating property investors and those looking to invest. 3, engage with government, regulators and the community to ensure that property investors receive appropriate representation in matters which directly or indirectly impact them. Number 4 was engage with the government, industry and business to ensure that property investors' consumer rights are protected and free from dishonest, deceptive or misleading conduct in light of the industry being unregulated. And number 5 was help inform and promote the financial and social benefits of a vibrant and sustainable property investment marketplace. So that's our charter, and our job is to work not only at a national level and a federal level, but also through our state councils to also try and advocate through those state councils on state-based matters, because we all know that property is a state-related matter, not necessarily a federal matter.
So, I mean, I guess did a lot of this coincide with when property investors were going to get shot dramatically with the negative gearing and the capital gains changes that Labor were proposing at the last election?
I think that's definitely one of the catalysts for us. There's been some big decisions at the federal government level, even depreciation, travel benefits and those types of things. So we'll talk more about that. But yeah, the idea was that the politics of the day suggests that property investors, they aren't coordinated, they aren't organised. So if we put some policy out there that's potentially going to have a negative impact on them, how would it impact us from a voting point of view? And so that was always so we obviously need to organise ourselves. We represent over 2.2 million property investors out there. So if we could coordinate ourselves, we would obviously have reach and impact as part of that. So as far as we're concerned, we have obviously our paid members, but we are representing those 2.2 million voters out there who basically, and certainly the negative gearing story was one of those where we were very active in working not only with our real estate association friends, but also PIPA for that matter. And we were, obviously, whilst I was away, I've recently been on a trip, we were successful in the Labor Party removing their policies on negative gearing and capital gains for now. We don't know what's coming into the future. There'll always be tension in that space, but the policy that they had clearly was not a good policy in terms of creating a sustainable marketplace, and it was going to have a negative impact on property prices. So, but we don't really need to go there. We need to say thank you, Labor, for listening, that you didn't take that same policy to a third election, because it would have also been problematic for you, I would have thought.
One of my questions for you, Ben, was going to be, why is there a need for property investors to band together? And you've just answered it beautifully, preemptively. And certainly, we interviewed you last time back in, I think it was episode 36 or something, quite a long time ago, which was all about this negative gearing issue. And one of the things that really, really got under my skin at that time about the policies that Labor were going to the election with, particularly with negative gearing, was the misuse of data, the misuse of statistics. And, if anyone hasn't remembered, I'll give you just two. One was that they came out saying that only 18% of people in the lower income bracket, so earning up to $80,000, only 18% of those actually use negative gearing. However, what they failed to say was that 80% of the people using negative gearing actually were in that price, in that income bracket. And it's like, it was so convenient to try to really put property investors as being fat cats that are really skimming, the profits of or making property unaffordable and really getting an unfair leg up the property ladder, and really that just lacking that pure honesty to actually be truthful about who's actually getting the most benefits out of it. The other one that used to really drive me nuts was Chris Bowen in particular always saying, why should some fat cat get their sixth or seventh property? And he's like, well, less than 3% property investors own more than 5 properties. And it's like, and I know that PICA are talking about, really harnessing more data and getting more of a... or using that as more of a platform, right? And so I'm really keen to know what's in store there, because that was just a key example about how it's really poor use of statistics to actually pigeonhole investors as all being privileged.
Yeah, look, I mean, a lot of people prefer bricks and mortar as a long-term safe investment to supplement their retirement. And that's clearly evident in, obviously the data that's showing that most people only own 1 or 2 properties outside of their principal home. And from my point of view, when governments look short-term versus longer-term, right? So if we think about negative gearing as an example, negative gearing as a strategy is a really dumb idea. So running a property as a loss so you can pay less tax is a really silly idea. But so is a silly idea of buying a house with $1 million mortgage if the value of that house doesn't continually to keep growing. Because ultimately over 15, 20 years or even 30 years, depending on how long it takes to pay that loan off, you're paying another $1 million in interest or beyond. So part of me sort of says, when I'm investing in property, I'm investing for the long term. Just as the government wants us to start new businesses and employ people, we get incentives or offsets to do that. So, when we run a business, we can claim some of our expenses for tax deductions. And so that's what general property investors get. But the idea when you are controlling an asset where you're also potentially leveraged is that over the longer period of time, that property will start to produce a passive income, and that passive income will eventually turn positive, which means that ultimately we will be paying the government additional taxes. And if we choose to sell that when we get towards retirement, then ultimately the capital gains, which would be a significant amount of money, even with a 50% exemption that currently applies. There is literally hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, that are flowing into the coffers of government over that longer period of time. So it's very easy for politicians who are ill-informed to think that they're just looking at the short term and they're looking at the negative impact on income receipts for the governments of the day to basically provide the services that they do. Now, the latest data that came out to the end of the 18-19 tax year, it's getting even closer to the net of negative gearing is becoming less and less. And that's just a product of lower interest rates and the lower cost of money. So we'll get very close. I mean, and remember that data's 18 months old. So if you actually were to look probably at today, there's more and more markets where properties are neutrally geared. And if you're holding that property for 5 to 7 years, as opposed to probably it used to be in the very basic modelling, it used to take around 9 to 10 years for properties to turn positively geared. That's going to be material. So I take the view that property investors absolutely contribute an enormous amount of tax revenue to the governments. But to start with, we actually get a little leg up to help us on our way. But that's also not factoring in the pension that we are no longer going to be eligible for because of the assets means test. So we are going to self-fund our retirement. We are not necessarily going to be a burden on the taxpayer when we retire because we've got this wealth base. So it's got to be a longer term win. And I would encourage Treasury and governments to do that modelling, to basically say to themselves, rather than, oh, we're negative $12 billion a year from negative gearing, and that's going down, to say, actually, over the long term, these guys pay their way, including land taxes, including all of the taxes that we pay. And we're doing an essential need in terms of providing accommodation for those people who are transient, those people who are potentially looking to new locations to test the waters if they want to live there, and longer term people who need essential accommodation, which the governments have also walked away from in terms of social housing as part of that.
I mean, a big one you sort of missed out as well, Ben, was really if they go and buy a new property, right? And the amount of money the state government, the federal government, the local councils make initially just by buying that property in society. So with PICA, do you have like an invest, because the property market is unregulated, do you see yourselves also as an educator of property investors on what potentially is going to get them a better result than if they follow traditional paths where they've gone and bought new property, or, you know, assets that you would know aren't the greatest long-term result for them?
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things, we're a broad church and there are a lot of people who invest in property for different reasons. And some who, yes, even though I say negative gearing is a bad idea, some of the advice that they might be receiving is to buy a property to reduce their tax. So as part of that sort of broad church, we don't necessarily sit here and advocate that off the plan isn't necessarily a great investment. We say just look at the data, look at the long-term performances of those types of things. There's some good data out there showing the performance between existing and new, which does show that new outperforms. But again, it depends on those types of things. So PIPA, which basically is the industry association for the people who operate in an unregulated environment, they, as I said, operate under a strict code of conduct where full disclosure should be part of the work that they're doing. From our point of view, it's like some people are accidental property investors where they've bought a house and then they've upgraded and then they've just turned, rather than selling that property, they've turned that property into an investment property. So for those types of people, and I suspect that would be anecdotally 20-30% of accidental property investors who come out of that side. And even during this pandemic, we're definitely anecdotally seeing people buying a second home or a third home in a regional or beachside location, or what would I call an escape location, where they're going into state where they think that they could outrun pandemics and lockdowns. That's going to be that has been part of this program that we are definitely seeing. And coming back to your point, Chris, about the mix of buyers at the moment, we definitely know that at the moment it's being led by upgraders and owner occupiers. But now that the first home buyers are falling away because of the incentives have been signed off on, and now that build program comes, we are seeing a real pickup in investor activity at the moment. And of course, you know, we are, if that continues and price growth continues at the pace in which it is growing, we're probably going to see some macroprudential interference in the marketplace.
So what are the main things that PICA as an organisation is sort of putting on the to-do list or the checklist of what we really want to lobby government on that we think is not really fair or sustainable, or is going to encourage more investors to enter the market? Because we've got a rental crisis just as much as we've got a housing affordability crisis. And to create better rental market, you need to create more rental supply, which is more investors. And so it's a real catch-22. So what are you working on at the moment at PICA that we need to be aware of?
Well, there's a lot going on in several different states. I'll start firstly with obviously the federal government. So the big one there is we felt that the measures around travelling to visit your property, let's say you've got a $500,000 asset interstate, it doesn't make sense that I can't go and inspect that property because it's owned in my personal name and claim some of those reasonable deductions for my cost of travelling to there, as well as obviously depreciation was the other one that the Morrison and Liberal governments introduced. We found that those sort of equity measures, I think they called them something along those lines, to be overdone. So I think it is only fair that if I own a $500,000 asset in another state, I should be able to claim the cost of going to that. Now, I think you can put a cap on that. There's no doubt that there might have been some people who were going to Queensland having a 2-week holiday and trying to claim the whole lot as a deduction. That's ridiculous. So let's say, you put $1,000 cap on going interstate to inspect your property. That would be one of them. The other one, obviously, with depreciation, is that we don't think it's fair that an oven that's 4 days old from the previous owner, when you buy that property, that you can't, basically write off the fair use of that oven or the fair use of some of that equipment. I think that, that in itself is not necessarily. When the irony is, if I buy this property in a company, I can actually do all of those. So it just highlights the indifference between the mum and dad investor versus the corporate investor. And another good example of that is build to rent. We're starting to see governments in different states, and I back the idea of providing affordable housing. But what gets me annoyed here is the 2.2 million investors who are also helping to provide supply. We don't get the land tax exemptions for 40 years. We don't necessarily get the incentives for us to do that heavy lifting, whereas we've actually done an enormous amount of that heavy lifting when it comes to providing rental accommodation. That said, that's the federal level. On the state level, there's one big thing going on in New South Wales at the moment around the stamp duty reform. So what we do there is we coordinate, and we've had meetings with government and Treasury of New South Wales to put our case forward about our concerns and lack of transparency around some of the disclosures. In other words, we still don't know what the rates are going to be for trusts. They still haven't fully disclosed those. So our job there is to just basically advocate on behalf of our constituents in New South Wales, and also people like me who own property in New South Wales but live in other states. So we're advocating heavily on that. And in the other states, the big issue at the moment is also the rental reform that we're seeing going on. So Queensland is currently active in finalising their position on rental reform or tenancy reform, and as is Western Australia. Now, we saw the disaster that was Victoria's policy. Unfortunately, it really has meant that the owner of the asset is now probably considered not in control of their asset anymore, with the removal of the 120-day no clause notice for vacation. That's really problematic. Now, fortunately, we did lobby in New South Wales, and that one didn't get up. The pet rental changes and a few other things, and some of the stuff we support, right? We don't want any landlord to be a slumlord, right? Do the right thing by your tenant. They are an asset to you. They look after your property. They get quiet enjoyment of that asset, and it's our job to make sure that they do that by ensuring that it's safe, and easy to live in, and it accommodates them comfortably. So they're the challenges we've got. Obviously, Labor governments in Queensland and Western Australia are looking at what's happened in Victoria, and they're proposing similar types of reforms. And fortunately, as I said, New South Wales didn't go down that path, and I just find that that's quite a challenging policy for those people who. And let's face it, sometimes you just have tenants where you're just not on the same page, right?
Yeah.
And it's just not working for either party. But to not being able to move them out unless you're forced to sell the property is just not in the best interest of the owner of the asset. So from my point of view, I just find that particular law was an overreach, and we'd like to also see that retracted in future when we do continue to lobby in the Victorian market.
How, with regards to this, particularly the state legislation that's going around the country, as you're talking about, for improving tenancy rights, and as you say, there's two sides of this, but they're not always opposing. There's a lot of overlapping. It's good to have good tenants. It's good to support long tenure. It's good to create all that security, but not at the expense of the flexibility as the person taking all the risks. Fundamentally to borrow and buy the property and own it and maintain it, etc., etc. Are you actively now being sought for consultation at this sort of policy formation stage now, or you sort of got to find the opportunities and go in there like rats up drain pipes?
We still have to knock on doors, so there's a new property forum that's just been set up by the ATO that we've been invited to. So there's a meeting of those, sort of industry leaders tomorrow. So there's a national meeting there. So we've got a seat at that table. So in some cases, because we've only been around for a few years, we're not necessarily a known quantity by some. But that's on us and obviously on the community of listeners that you guys have through this great podcast to basically get on board, right? Because again, if we don't have size and scale, they are just going to walk all over us. So we need to make sure that, for example, the tenancy associations in every state and territory, and please don't get me wrong here, there is a need for them because, some landlords do the wrong thing. It's that classic case of that 5% or 2% on both sides, who basically means that we regulate to the lowest common denominator, and we have all this over-regulation because basically a small group of people on either side are doing the wrong thing. And I can give you horror examples of landlords, but I can also give you just as many disgraceful examples of tenants who are blatantly ripping off their landlords, especially during this pandemic in Victoria. There's a certain opportunity that some tenants have discovered, and I'm not going to publicly announce it because if more and more tenants knew about this, they potentially could be ripping off their landlords. So we're trying to work with government, but look, the Andrews government is a bit chaotic at the moment. It's a bit unorganised and so we haven't seen the necessary reform. Yet we saw the other states move quickly to stop this little loophole that has occurred. So it's examples like that really annoy me because, again, we have this regulation, coming back to your question, Veronica, around why do we need to go to such extremes to get, when the vast majority of relationships are a win-win and, tenants and landlords are getting on with things in a really comfortable way. But they get millions and millions of dollars every year from state governments to run these tenancy associations. So they have lobbyists, they're producing reports, they're constantly being able to put their view across the eyes of the politicians, and that's how these reforms take shape. So we need to obviously build ourselves up to a size and scale, and again, we're all volunteers here, to be able to produce those reports, produce those insights, and being able to lobby to get those changes or get our position known.
We did an interview with Brett Evans. I'm not sure if it's gone live yet, but it's an expat financial advisor, and he was doing a lot of lobbying for expats, which is a growing part of the property investment market. Together with first home buyers, they might not be buying homes, but they're buying investment properties because the house is unaffordable. They've only got limited assets and borrowing capacity. And so these are two markets that, aren't really got the feet on the ground and have been around for a long time. But he spoke around lobbying for expats around a lot of the primary place of residence exemptions that just all got pushed through Parliament. And they did all this work, and then Parliament just went ahead with sort of what they were planning. Is that sort of what your experience is, Ben, when you're dealing with, the government, that even though you're doing lobbying, it's not going to get sort of heard unless you get a significant number of sort of people part of PICA?
Look, I'd like to think that some politicians can listen. And I'd also like to think that the Treasury and the people sort of behind those politicians will also have a listening ear. So they're the people that I'm more interested in talking to in terms of the people who set policy and are sort of designing the models behind the scenes. So I'd never say never, Chris, but I also know that the political clout is got to do with basically, pleasing the majority where you can, because at the end of the day, they all want to stay in power. So again, if we turned around with our 2 million voters and we could communicate to those 2 million voters, you would be amazed in terms of how much attention we would get, in terms of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging sort of conversation, isn't it? Because their interests are sometimes not in line with your interests, right? And you're sort of banging your head against the wall because, you just haven't got enough power, right?
So there's a federal affordability inquiry that's commenced, and effectively, they're looking at solutions here. And I think what's interesting about the approach is that they're really looking at the supply side and in terms of what can be done on that. And I don't disagree with them around if we want to. It's very difficult to control property prices when you've got cheap money and you've got no supply and you've got high demand. So I think that is a good idea to be basically focusing in on. And coming back to your point before, Chris, about the costs, the Housing Industry Association has produced report after report talking about the cost of the first time a house has been owned, subdivided land, and a house is being built as being between 30 to 41% of the cost of that property is in taxes and infrastructure costs and those types of things. So that would be a good reason to be highlighting, because I don't think the broader community understands that when a developer subdivides, and don't get me wrong, they make lots of money when they do those subdivisions, but an enormous amount of that cost is actually in getting that house out of the ground and the infrastructure that goes in around that. And they're asking the developers, which ultimately pass on those costs to the consumer in buying that property.
We interviewed Michelle Adair recently about the whole housing affordability and supply of long-term rentals, et cetera, issue. It's a massive issue, a very complicated issue, and obviously a policy nightmare for governments. And particularly, as you mentioned earlier, that governments have been increasingly short-term in their thinking, as it seems. And of course, this is a big picture, long-term thinking or problem, right? And
yes,
needs to be tackled. The policy needs to be addressed in that way. But, because back to sort of the way the government uses investors in many ways is actually as pawns, to stimulate, and first home buyers for that matter, to stimulate the construction industry. And so then you'd say there's all these taxes that are involved, and we've discussed this before. At each layer of government, there's so many taxes involved in that whole development process. And of course, that gets laid into the price of the property. And then we also do know there's a lot of data around, you mentioned earlier, about the resale prices of new properties, the amount of losses that are incurred by those first buyers. So you've got a situation where these people, in all their hopefulness of becoming investors, of becoming first home buyers, are actually thrown into the mix and really pawns in terms of our economy in this country, and then left to suffer the consequences individually. And it's an issue. It's a massive issue. And obviously, if that's not being tackled or brave enough to be addressed at policy level, it's just going to continue.
Yes, look, we've got a situation where 60% of our economy is made up of consumption. And so when, a safe bet for any federal political party is to go quick and go households, and what they do there in terms of stimulating that, because every dollar that goes into property, there's a $10 lift in terms of spend for the economy. So, that's direct and indirect as well. And obviously I think it's the third biggest employer in Australia. So you can understand why governments who are looking to increase employment and get the economy moving do go towards households. But the consequences of such are that you're going to obviously increase the demand and you're going to increase prices as part of that story. So it is delicate. There's no easy answer to housing affordability. I think you'll find it will ultimately be a combination of things that need to happen in conjunction with each other and over a longer period of time if you're going to have any success in terms of providing affordable rental accommodation and affordable housing. We also need to set an honest conversation with people around what their expectations are around what they're going to be able to get to, right? So I could buy a home that might be a 2-bedroom unit as an entry-level property for still under $300,000 in some parts of our major centres. But no, if I want a house and I want that house in a really great location, that's the differentiation that we need to sort of make sure we define, because everyone, I mean, if someone says, Ben, you could have a house in Mosman and you can overlook the harbour and, you can have it for $300,000, everyone would look at me and say, that's ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. Well, that's where we do need to make that separation in terms of housing expectation versus housing affordability. And I'm not trying to be rude about that. I'm just basically saying, look, a lot of the housing affordability surveys are basically expectation surveys of what the next generation believe they should have access to. And I think, whilst I appreciate it's very difficult from a deposit point of view, and it's not easy to get into that, you could find similar stories post-war, post-Second World War, through the 60s of the building boom and the Great Australian Dream. This story was in the 70s and the 80s and continues to this day in the 2000s, right? So I think that's an important message that we need to also convey to people, that those things are going to be part of the policy positioning that needs to happen if we're going to have any chance of solving housing affordability.
If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. So it's funny you say that, because the reality is, like you say, if you made it all cheaper and all more affordable, then the demand will basically take care of that. And the next minute, it's all good. It's market forces take over. So that's just another level of complexity. And the governments, I've heard governments on all sides basically saying, well, both sides, I should say, saying, look, supply is the answer. We need to build more and then that'll solve the problem. It doesn't actually solve the problem.
No, I mean, look, housing, the whole 53% of the wealth in this country is built on our housing stock, right? So $9 trillion now. It's too big to fail. So the reality is, and we come back to that example we used earlier about, if I borrow $1 million and I buy a house for $1 million, the last thing I want is in 20 years' time for that house to be worth $1 million when it's cost me $2 million. So appreciation needs to occur, because if I then as a generation see that basically there's no appreciation in houses, then effectively, there's a risk of a run on values of property and, the whole thing implodes. And we only need to look at, not too distant past, where we did see housing markets of the US, of Ireland, of Greenland, of all of these centres where they basically they were led by cheap lending and huge crazy irrational optimization, and we had property bubbles. And it destroys the fabric of the economy. It destroys the whole lending system. And so it is too big to fail in this country. We've got to acknowledge that, whilst also potentially looking at policy decisions that will allow for, sort of more stock. And, we're seeing right now in the US and the UK, they're introducing reforms around planning. And I've been an advocate for this for a long time. But basically, we have a lot of planning regulation in all states and territories which restrict the amount of houses that can be built in certain streets. And my view is how you can potentially change that is you introduce what I call a ratio. And the ratio means that for every street, there can be one subdivided block into two duplexes. Okay, so it's going to reduce the cost of the land, which is ultimately going to reduce the cost of the price of the house. So we are going to, this will be part of the suite of reforms that need to be introduced to basically make housing more affordable. And you will see some more duplexes and some more, brown sites be rejuvenated into more accommodation. It's just the fact that not in my backyard, right? We have this problem. But if you have a rule that says, okay, it's 1% of properties along each street or road or something like that, you'll start to, it won't be everyone knocking their homes over, and you won't change the dynamic of the area. Now, you would tweak that over 20 to 50 or 100 years, where you might move it to 5% or something along those lines. But that's one of the ideas that you've got to start thinking about, to basically allow for people to want to build something that they can live in. And we're getting better and better at building more compact houses, still with 2 living zones and still with 2 bathrooms and still the amenity of the backyard and so forth. So again, it's just one of the ideas that could play out over the course of the next decade.
So my brain immediately goes to, okay, so once the 1%'s taken up, you've got one block left in the suburb, and what happens to the price of that?
Well, it obviously goes up, right, because it's a scarcer asset. But the point being is, if you've got a street of 50 houses and only one of those, and once that street's done, that's it, it's one and done, right? And then the next street has to get their one, and then the next street. So because if you introduce a policy whereby it's 10% along this street, it'll just be too much too quickly. And so again, you're still trying to make sure that those townhouses are a 30% reduction on the freestanding freestanding homes. But that's, again, one of the policy ideas that the UK are now looking at as part of their solution, because they don't have as much land as what we do, but they also know that greenfield areas are very expensive to develop. And governments are looking now, here in Victoria, the state government is whacked an additional tax on developers for subdividing or change of land use, so rezoning. They're doing a land grab, a cash grab there. So this again that'll just flow on to the buyer. Ultimately, it'll be put into the profitability and the margins of what the developers make. So it's costing us at the end of the day as consumers.
So Ben, I guess you mentioned at the start there could be some intervention, I guess, into the property market from government regulators to slow down the market, and maybe investors will be the first ones they target, because they're an easy one to target, right? Because we want first home buyers, we don't mind people upgrading, because that's great for, it's houses, it's not investors. But what do you think they're going to potentially look to target them with? Because, interest-only loans was the first thing they really targeted, back in 2014, because they were out of control. Half of loans were going on interest only. It's not only an issue for the individual, but it's an issue for the whole economy if they don't start paying these loans back. But, they're 1 in 10 loans or 1 in 8 loans right now. So that's not an issue. Investors are still, the loan growth still very slow, nowhere near like it was, in the past. So what are you sort of things, from the investor side that they need to be aware of that they could start to target, coming up?
Look, the Reserve Bank of Australia have learnt very, very well about the signalling that they put into the market. So I think it was probably 15 years ago where the Reserve Bank started to be a little bit more public in terms of their announcements and basically what they were projecting into the marketplace. And they used that as an instrument to also potentially control the financial markets and give some direction and so forth. What we saw with APRA, with the macroprudential interference in the marketplace with, first of all, as you say, speed humps, growing loan books by greater than 10% for investors for interest only. We did see that more broadly work. So the perception now in the marketplace and potentially throughout the business community and even the investor community, that if APRA signals that they're going to make a change, then technically they're going to watch what happens to the psychology of the buyer. And so I'm hoping that they won't need to do the same measures that they introduced last time, but just that signalling alone could hopefully then dampen the level of demand and interest from investors. Not all investors, but I suspect the ones who are thinking this is a quick kill and property's easy and everyone makes money out of property. So they may introduce something like that throttle on loan book growth for investors, that can't be more than 10% month on month. And just that could just be enough to basically take the momentum. And we'll see that showing up in the sentiment surveys and those types of things. So because we knew it worked, it took the demand completely out of the marketplace for investors in 2018. As everyone started to understand basically what was going on, and all of the fear-mongering that went with that around switching from interest only to P&I, and there was going to be this sort of fiscal cliffs in households and everyone wasn't going to be able to afford to make those repayments. Well, we knew that was a load of rubbish, but it had its intended purpose in terms of scaring the market. So I'd like to think that if they have an interest in this particular space, that we get that scaring of the market first before we actually get the implementation, which is effectively, that interference.
But do you think we forget? I mean, all of that it's recent history. We all know it because we live and breathe property. We're in this day in, day out. But, new investors, for instance, wouldn't really probably been paying any attention. Existing investors, will they now, in this face of rising prices and FOMO and all the rest of it, do you think that they forget that that's a possibility?
Yes, I mean, some would, but I mean, hopefully you're not going out and spending $500,000 or $1 million without doing some due diligence and asking for some professional advice would be my, recommendation to people. And people have got to understand that, we are in a state of a FOMO, and so we're trying to move that sort of fear of missing out into a more sustainable marketplace. But we also can blame a bit of the, eyeball media in terms of the clickbait. There's no longer are we in a boring property market. We're either in boom or bust. So I think from that point of view, and I think coming back to your question, Chris, one of the things I think is their biggest instrument is probably around the floor rate or the assessment rates that they get the banks to use. I suspect that they will taper borrowing power, which will hit a ceiling for the vast majority of people who might be stretching themselves. I think from a loan to value ratio point of view, in terms of what New Zealand and all that are doing, I'm not sure that would work here. But I also am very conscious of people who are trying to get their third or fourth investment property on a 95% loan to value ratio. I think that is you're on a flogging to nowhere there if you want to risk the whole, house of cards falling over through greed. So it is just about balancing that out. And I think mortgage brokers will be where they go to in terms of, because a lot of mortgage brokers are becoming reasonably educated in terms of the property market. So hopefully that education will flow through and that distribution channel will slow a little bit of that sort of FOMO and irrational buying behaviour that we're seeing.
That's a hard one though, isn't it? Because let's face it, and Chris is a mortgage broker, and I advocate that people use brokers rather than go directly to banks.
Yep.
But there is a conflict of interest there, isn't it? Because let's face it, you get paid a trailing commission on the loans you write. And so how many brokers honestly do you think actually recommend that their clients don't borrow the maximum? I mean, do we have any data on that?
I don't. Look, the only anecdotal assessment you could do of that is the percentage of borrowers in arrears as the channel. So if you did mortgages versus direct channel, you would probably understand what that looks like. Now, in most cases, and this is, again, they're going after the investor rather than the homeowner because politically that's more palatable. But what we do know, and it's very clear in the data, that most of the people who are in arrears are usually owner-occupiers. And it's the owner-occupiers who normally stretch themselves more than the investor does because they've got an emotional invested interest in that property. I mean, a classic story that I brokered for years, for over a decade. First home buyers would come in and sit down with you and they'd say, oh, we've got a budget of 550. Oh, great, fantastic. Okay, we'll get that sorted out for you. And then they'd go and have a look at properties worth 550 and realise, wait a minute, those properties, even though they're being advertised for 550, sell for 610 or 630. And so they're knocking back on your door, basically saying, can we have a reach? Because then they go and have a look at the 550 properties, but they're like, mentally, they visualise themselves in the better home. It's like going to a car dealership and you see the basic version and you see the souped up version, and you had a plan when you walked in there, but that plan's now out the door. And so that's where responsible lending and a lot of the adequate inquiries that are being made around affordability and so forth. And because I'm a huge fan of brokers, don't get me wrong, I think their knowledge as a specialised industry operator compared to, say, the banks, it's chalk and cheese, absolutely chalk and cheese, and the ability to be able to find a lending solution compared to a one person operator who has a fixed or a variable or a line of credit product to offer. It basically is the reason why brokers are now pushing well above 60% of all home loans being written.
So Ben, I mean, I guess the big worry for investors right now is, let's say you've got a couple of properties, or even if it's just one property, right, and it is at a high LVR because maybe you're a first home buyer that couldn't buy a house and you just bought an investment property somewhere and you got a 90% loan, right? The worry is that some legislation could come in late this year and they could say, look, you can't refinance that loan because it's an investment property because it's over 80%. They could easily implement that say all properties that are investments have to have an LVR under 80%. And so what sort of PICA doing in terms of who are you trying to speak to in terms of getting on the front foot when these type of legislations come out, where it's a simple policy for new property, new investors, but existing investors could be smashed. So is it APRA that you need to be speaking to for this? Is it the local member of parliament? And who do you go to with these sort of when the shit hits the fan, I guess?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is APRA. At the end of the day, their mandate is a very strong and robust and safe lending environment. So they are the ones who basically have the levers to pull. Look, I give credit to APRA in terms of, when APRA came out with their idea, the story was the Reserve Bank didn't believe it would work. But it obviously did in terms of tapering demand. I'm of the view that they would be, the data that they're getting now from the major banks or the ADIs, actually all ADIs, is very sophisticated data now. They've had sort of 5 or 6 years to be able to organise their data suites. And I suspect something like that is an example where you cannot refinance a loan when you've got an existing property because you want to get a cheaper rate. That basically, I can't see them introducing a policy like that. And I'll give you an example. So under the Smurfs, self-managed super funds, lending, refinancing was quite difficult earlier on because obviously you can't release equity when you're buying a self-managed super fund product. But in this particular case, we are now seeing the ability to refinance from one self-managed super fund lender to another, because we knew that there was lots of lenders out there that collapsed after the Royal Commission. So there's not a lot of lenders out there, and they are gouging. I mean, some of the interest rates you're paying on your self-managed super fund loans. So we are starting to see some more of those refinances starting to go through. So I would like to think that APRA can use that as an example for themselves in terms of they don't want to see any consumer who has a problem with repayment being restricted or penalised by their lender. It's more than new business, new lending, new monies coming into the system that I think they'll go after, Chris.
That's interesting you say that, Ben, because I actually had a client that was impacted like that. the way that they sort of structured their business, and there was a divorce and there was a few sort of messy things that went on, that meant for a period of time they didn't have, and they were in business for themselves, and so they had a period of time where they had tax returns that showed a loss and all that sort of stuff, yet they had a really good property portfolio, and they were stuck at, one particular property was stuck at a really high interest rate because of the structuring of it. And when they went to the bank said, well, you won't qualify for that loan now. Even though they'd been repaying it all the time, they never missed a payment, you won't requalify for it. We can't refinance it. And they wanted to upgrade their home, and the whole thing had to get put on hold for 2 years so that they could actually then resubmit tax returns. And in the whole time, they were then paying a higher amount of interest than they could have been. And so supposedly responsible lending saying, oh, no, we wouldn't lend you that money again, but you already have lent me that money, and I can't actually get access to a lower interest rate now because of the responsible lending changes. So I've heard of, I mean, that was one client I'm thinking of in particular.
No, they're everywhere, Chris. You've got, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's prolific, right? I mean, the reality is all new customers at banks are probably paying 40 to 60 basis points than what customers even a year or 2 years ago are paying, And so if you haven't refinanced or gone to your bank in the last 2 years, you're paying 40 or 50%, basis points more expensive. And a lot of those people can't refinance, right? Like maybe they've gone on maternity leave, or maybe, they've swapped jobs and they had a big commission impact, or maybe they've gone casual, or they've cut their hours. And they go back to the bank asking for better pricing, and then the bank says, hang on a sec, they can see that maybe you're not going to be able to leave, they can see what's coming in. And some banks do pricing based on the risk of you leaving. And so absolutely they're taking advantage of those customers because they're saying, well, we got you on a great rate at the time. That's no longer a great rate, so we're going to make money off you. And all these new customers who are going to qualify, we're going to give them a better rate. So there's a loyalty tax that's massive. And even bigger at the non-banks, which were pretty prolific a couple of years ago as a percentage of the mortgage market. And they charge higher rates, but they also know that if you get you on board, it's harder for you to refinance. And so the idea is you'll always be able to refinance in the future, but they know that it's unlikely you're going to be able to do that. So, it's a big issue.
It is, and I think it's well highlighted, Veronica. I know of many, many cases. I think pre-APRA is coming in and basically putting these sort of floor rates and these speed limits on assessment rates and so forth. There's 5 years of that legacy that has definitely flowed through, and P&I switching overs and those types of things where you simply can't borrow the money that you used to be able to borrow. I mean, Chris and I go back to low docs and no docs, and the differential between lender A and lender D was $300,000 on the same assessable income. Those numbers have creeped in a little bit. That's been tightened, so you don't necessarily have that. But I say obviously in that situation, they hadn't planned for a divorce. They hadn't planned for all of the other elements of it. But it just goes to show you that when you sit down with a great broker and you get to see the pros and cons of what's going on, and you understand that, this is a moment in time, and you are doing your cash flow modelling and you're doing all of those things to factor in some of those variables, that's what you've got to understand. And from an investor's point of view, there's always risk, right? So if you think you can come into investing in property and you think that there's no risk, we've just highlighted some of the risks right then and there. So I think a well-informed investor needs to understand there's a risk and there's a cost of doing business. And if you understand that cost of doing business and you still see the upside being greater than that, you'll make a calculated decision on what LVR you land at, and then basically what price you buy at, and ultimately, what returns you receive.
But on a individual property, so let's say I'm a PICA member, right? And I've got an apartment, let's just say in Little Bay in Sydney, and it might, Maritona proposing a massive development out that way, right? And it doesn't really fit in with the local landscape. It's a lot of apartments. It's high rises where you got houses, right? And if I was an investor of a property there, I'd be very upset with this because it's just proliferation of supply that's going to affect the. And so, do you do sort of campaigning on an individual sort of level, not an individual, but a community level, let's call it, where you think that property investors are getting disadvantaged by ill-informed, council action, I guess, where they're rezoning. You know, there's parts of Melbourne, for example, where it's just not fair zoning. You know, you've got houses and then you've completely changed it to high rises, and that's affecting investors, affecting the houses, etc. So are you getting involved with that, or are you sort of saying, no, we'll just get involved at the top end, not on the ground floor?
So what we do is we have some fundamental webinars that we produce. Veronica's produced a webinar, and we have those on demand for our members of the association, right? So it's $5 to join for a year, or $20 for 5 years, right? So it's basically a cup of coffee.
Cheap as chips.
Cheap as chips. And, you know, we run on the smell of an oily rag because of it, because we really, you know, basically, again, all volunteer our time. So if you were to watch 3 or 4 of those webinars from some industry experts, you would learn relatively quickly about some of the risks associated with oversupply and potential, you know, sort of rezonings that occur in those particular locations. And that's what you've got to be, you know, Woolite Creek is another good example near the airport there. When you do know that there's going to be a significant arrival of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that there will be a period of time where there will be oversupply and property prices will be affected. And then if you look 20, 30, 40 years on from that, eventually the market will settle itself down and you'll basically, you know, sort of move back to probably an appreciating trajectory. So we can't probably fight for each individual investor. We do get people reaching out to us with, as I said, some shocking stories. Like I found out about that loophole in Victoria through one of our members reaching out to us and saying, here's my story. And it was just OMG, like I could not believe what this particular tenant was doing. And, you know, so we took that to the lawyers to see whether we could get anything done there. So we can encourage people to then speak to the industry representatives in that particular space. But the reality is at the moment, Chris, we're not big enough yet. We need to get bigger. And then when we build out our state councils and then those area representatives, and we do, you know, pre-COVID, we were doing meetups and people were basically sharing their stories. Again, we're run by property investors for property investors. We're not the industry association. We're basically getting mum and dads to sit down in an RSL and have a bit of a chat about what's going on, you know, what's working for them, what's not working for them, and just share that knowledge and then make your own informed decision, as opposed to, you know, if someone wants to listen to me for the first time, I want them to have a healthy level of skepticism. I want them, you know, if you're coming to my business, I want you to have a healthy level of skepticism because, you know, at the end of the day, I earn money from you engaging us to do some work. So I always say to anyone, if you're going to invest, there are risks, and also make sure about the people that you're dealing with, how are they paid, what are the commission structures, what track record have they got, what reviews have they got. All of those things will help inform you in terms of that. Coming back to your question about, yes, particular pockets of subdivision and those type of things, we just don't have the reach to get into, you know, into the local council and go and picket them or anything like that.
Yeah, I think
So
that's good
we
on an individual level, just to be able to share your story, right? Just get it off your chest, share it with an organisation that can share it with their members, and and other people can't make those mistakes, right? Because hopefully through sharing or learning that knowledge, you don't go and follow that. Which perfect segue, to be honest, into our Dumbo of the week. Ben, have you got one for us? You know, a story that we can all learn from?
Yeah, well, I think I've got a well-documented story, but I'm happy to share it. Like, I think I've shared it quite a bit, but not everyone's heard it. But I'm about $700,000 in the red from a decision that I made. I bought my first property when I was 23, across the road from mum and dad. I was a novice, obviously a rookie, not knowing what I was doing. I paid $120,000 for this property in Bundoora. That property now could probably attract a $900,000 to $1 million price point. It's had some renovations done to it since then, but I sold that for $165,000 some 4 or 5 years after I bought that, because I got some tax advice, and that tax advice said this property is positively geared. I was living in Sydney at the time. This property is positively geared, so you need to sell that property. You need to sell that property and go and buy, ready for it, an off the plan apartment in Zetlands at the time. Right, this was when Zetlands was being developed down in Moore Park. And so I've gone, all right, well, you're the expert. I'll go off and, you know, so I went and put put $1,000 deposit down with my little red dot on the apartment that I picked, right?
Yeah.
And then something didn't feel right to me, right? I started to do some reading and some investigation. So I cooled off, got my $1,000 back, but I still sold the Melbourne property, right? And so all I needed to do was renovate the kitchen and the bathroom, and that property would now be in the portfolio, adding to a beautiful passive income that my family and I can enjoy for our future endeavours and sort of quiet enjoyment. So that's a perfect example. And I'm dealing with a couple of clients at the moment where they're thinking about selling one of their properties because of their uncertain circumstances. So work isn't necessarily strong for them at the moment, but they do have a buffer, but they're seeing their bank account just basically going backwards, and they're a classic case of a loan going from interest only to P&I. And so this is where mindset is so powerful when you control money versus it controls you. We had a long conversation last night after, as I said, I've been away for a couple of months, and I just sort of said to them, look, whilst I appreciate what's going on, as your accountability partner, I care, but I'm not going to care to the level that you guys want irrational thinking and irrational behaviour to take hold. So we agreed that, because they'd already, by the time I found out, they'd already got an agent engaged and so forth. So I said, for this to happen, it needs to sell at the absolute top end of the range. And if it doesn't, the 90-day exclusive that you got, you're cooling off, and we're going to put a tenant in there. And I promise you, because I don't want you to be in the same, I don't want you telling a story like I just did, where you reflect on the property that you sold a decade or 2 decades ago, and that money coming in and being part of your nest egg. So that's my dumbo. I'm pointing the light bulb straight on me in terms of being the dumbo for selling that property.
Well, actually, it's funny because both Megan and I share our own Dumbo stories a lot, actually, on your First Home Buyer Guide podcast, because of exactly that. It's like I actually went calculated it, and I think conservatively, if I hadn't, I racked up what some of the mistakes that I've made along the way, and I think there's definitely $1 million that I don't have that I could have had had I made better decisions, but also had I got better advice, and sometimes had I acted on the advice, sometimes actually had I had better advice. So it's cautionary tales for sure. Thanks for sharing that with us, Ben. Now, we're going to put the link in the show notes to PICA, and we encourage you to join. Even if you're thinking about becoming an investor, you're not actually a property investor at the moment, because, let's face it, $20 for 5 years or $5 a year, it's worthwhile, because I think it's so important that we do join our voices together. And, I think we're in good hands with Ben and the board in terms of what they're advocating for. So thanks for coming on and sort of running us through that, Ben. I think that's been a great chat. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a good chat, Ben. I guess it's going to be interesting what happens in the next 12 months as well, because you can already start to see it. We're seeing it with clients, that have got a property, and they're saying, even this morning, one email said, I would like to talk to Chris about some investment, what we can do, borrowing capacity in there. Low rates are encouraging them to, they're doing well on their current property that's got a bit of equity now. Strong incomes, and so they're starting to think. Investors always come to the party late. They did in 2017. Yeah, they'll do it again this year. They're always the sheep, and so they're going to be I think they're going to be targeted pretty hard. I think by the end of this year. So good luck with all your campaigning there, because I think you'll need it with the way government work.
Thanks, Chris.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a dumbo.